Hello. The next speaker will be Ona Leganovic, and she will present us an historical insight into radio communication and radio communication legislation. So without further talk, please have fun with Funkerspuk.
Yeah, okay. The stuff I'm going to talk about today will by no means be complete or exhausting. In fact, I think there are quite a few people in this building that know much more about most of the topics than me. But so far, I haven't seen the kind of comparison I want to make anywhere before, so it will be interesting anyway. So what are those topics? Radio politics of days long gone, mostly the 1920s. Why are they of any interest? Well, I find them strange enough in themselves, but for anybody interested in current policies regarding communication technologies, this will be interesting too, because here you can find some roots of current policies, some debates that resonate to this day, arguments that were given for the first time, paradigms in the making. So first I'm going to talk about what happened in the USA, then I'm going to talk about what happened in the Weimar Republic. I plan to go a little bit more into the Third Reich and stuff, but that would be too much for 1 hour, so I cut it out. And then there will be some, more miscellaneous stuff about some ideas that I have, how this relates to current policies, but I decided to leave the real outlook more to the discussion because I think many people here will know much more about communications technology policies of today than I do, so that would be a good topic for discussion. So, and then there are 5 questions to bear in mind maybe during the talk, and they are useful for not just understanding this talk, but understanding a lot of other stuff too. First question, what is regulated? The second, why is it regulated? Then, how is it regulated? Who regulates it? And maybe the most important one of all, who cares? After radio was invented at the turn of the century, the first people to put it to use were amateurs, of course, until they managed to make a living out of it, like Marconi, who was 1901, the first one to successfully send a wireless signal across the Atlantic, who later built a near monopoly on wireless equipment that held till about 1912. And not just amateurs, but the military was on their heels. The US Navy starts to establish coastal stations and to outfit the fleet with wireless communication equipment in 1898. In 1906, the first international regulation is set in place by the Berlin International Wireless Telegraph Convention, which also deems the term radio to be more appropriate. 1909, the first amateur radio club is founded. What is important to bear in mind during this stage is we're not talking about broadcasting, but about two-way communication, basically. There is, at that stage, already a senator in the USA who tries to kill off amateur radio completely, but the bill he brings into Congress doesn't pass, and so they can go on playing. But the amateurs, and by this time there are already pretty many of them. In 1916 there are 10,000 licensed radio amateurs. They start to pose a problem to the public. That is, the public in the form of more, let's say, government organizations or anybody who deems his own communications more important than the amateurs. The problems are mostly interference because too many people try to send on the same frequencies, and prankster calls. There is a tragic incident you might all have heard about, the sinking of the Titanic. The tragedy for radio concerning the Titanic is there were two ships near enough to, who could have rescued people, but one of those ships was not equipped with radio equipment. The other ship, the radio operator was asleep. And then there were ships farther away who tried to still organize a rescue mission, but they could barely communicate because there was so much interference constantly and constant prankster calls. So they could not organize, they could not, that was one of the reasons that those rescue missions did not really do what they could have done otherwise. This provokes a public outcry in 1912 and the first kicking of radio legislation. The result of this legislation is not, it's not so much, it's barely the necessities of regulation concerning frequency bands, like the amateurs get certain frequencies so they don't interfere with the others. Different kinds of communication get different kinds of priorities so that emergency calls are not allowed to interfere with them or make pranks emergency calls anymore, stuff like that. Basically, this legislation tries to ensure that important messages really come through. And amateurs, amateur licensing is introduced. So, but this licensing doesn't seem to ever have been really a problem, differently than in Germany, we will later see. So, there's some mix-up here. For the beginning of broadcasting, of course, there's another major historic event, the World War I, which is a good focal point for radio amateurs because in the USA, radio amateurs are already in existence, and the Army can use their expertise, their education. They are there like a resource that only has to be tapped. There are some issues because during the war, the Navy seizes control of most of the radio stations and commercial radio communication stations in existence, and she does not really want to give that control back when the war is over, but she does not come through with that. So radio amateurs are not allowed to send during the war, but in 1990 all goes back to normal. Then in 1920, broadcasting starts. That's where we are now. And broadcasting is working like a landslide after KDKA in Pittsburgh, owned by Westinghouse Electric, covers in 1920 presidential elections. By the end of 1920, there are 30 stations broadcasting. In 1924, there are already 500. This, of course, brings more problems. More problems of the kind that, basically messages coming through gets difficult again. Too many people on not enough frequencies, no regulation at all in place. It's obvious that even if there are more and more stations going on the air, people will not be able to receive more because they're just interfering with each other all the time, and this gets really nasty. So the first radio conference is organized by Mr. Herbert Hoover, future president, by that time the Secretary of Commerce. This first radio conference is attended by about 30 individuals, persons in charge of broadcasting, politicians and amateurs, And I find it very significant, and I want you to bear in mind that here, where the important issues of radio legislation are debated, amateurs are, of course, invited in. One person counting as an amateur at that time and at that conference is Edwin Armstrong, who later got notorious. But main issues Hoover wanted to address at that conference were public interest. Public interest meaning that, of course, it is in the public interest to be able to receive clearly. And second is who is to broadcast and to what purpose. And already there are complaints that direct advertising is to be curbed. The interpretation of these issues is mostly preventing signal interference, selecting quality broadcast programming, and thwarting censorship and ownership monopolies. There is a result in the form of a draft for legislation enabling Hoover to regulate monopolies and making broadcasting parties entirely responsible for programs carried. That is, quality programming is understood as not entailing, Gott, was heißt Beleidigung? Egal. Assaults and personal stuff, and so by making the programmers responsible, they try to address that problem. But at that time, this legislation does not come through because Congress has fear of placing too much control on Hoover's hands, and because this legislation lacked industry backing. Of course, the industry did not want to have Hoover able to regulate monopolies. But and another issue was how to pay for broadcasting. I won't go into much detail here. Basically, the listeners insisted on receiving for free, as opposed to a fee. The speakers, or potential speakers, wanted to make sure that they can access the airwaves, that they don't get shut down, shut out, whatever. And the broadcasters wanted a tax, or a fee if you want that way, because that would have made it much easier for them. They did not want un-American views and distasteful material, that is, the right to decide what they want to send themselves. But at least with the tax, they did not come through. So the boom goes on. The regulation is still not in place, and of course it gets more pressing. The next year, at the second radio conference, interference problems have only gotten worse. Of course, more stations are on the air now. Partly, it's gotten worse because Hoover is not allowed to deny a broadcasting license if somebody applies for one, hindering reception, like everybody was standing on each other's feet and nobody getting anywhere. Special interest groups have started to crystallize, forming identified groups like commercial entertainment broadcasters, by far the biggest, educational broadcasters, and amateurs. And those groups are connected to different classes of broadcasting equipment. Mostly in regards to wattage, that is like how good and how far they can transmit. And so this second conference, the differently equipped stations get assigned different classes translating to different frequency bands. But because those equipment classes are not just equipment classes, but basically relate to those groups, different interest groups, this also is a judgment about the value of different kinds of broadcasting. That is,